Hello, welcome to the morning news. The path to remove Cuba from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism overcame another hurdle as right-wing lawmakers announced that they will not try to challenge President Obama's decision after all. They announced their decision after Obama's request to remove the island's name from the list following meetings with Cuban President Raúl Castro at the Summit of the Americas. Republican opponents of the Cuban Revolution said Congress could not legally prevent the president from taking Cuba off the list. However, the conservative legislators signaled that they intend to prevent the lifting of the economic blockade, despite the recent polls that confirm most Americans support ending the aggressions against Cuba. High Court in Honduras took an unprecedented step by changing the constitution in order to remove presidential term limits. The Supreme Court voted 5-0 to strike down the prohibition on presidential re-election after current President Juan Orlando Hernández's National Party pushed to make the change. With the legislator unlikely to approve it, the ruling party petitioned the judges to invoke it, saying the change violated human rights. Members of the Supreme Court and the National Party supported the 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya. They argued that the president wanted to change the constitution in order to allow re-election. The northern Mexican state of Tamaulipas saw violence after authorities arrested 4 members of the Gulf cartel. According to reports, shootings and roadblocks and the burning of vehicles followed the arrest, resulting in 2 people killed. The troubled Mexican state has been at the center of violence during the so-called drug war, with fighting between cartels as well as with security forces. And according to Colombia's Broad Front for Peace, hundreds of deaths and injuries have been avoided thanks to the unilateral ceasefire by the FARC rebels. The group is now calling for the government to join in the truce. Our correspondent Natalia Margarita has this report from Bogota.
160 army members' deaths and at least 1,000 injured have been prevented as a result of the FARC's unilateral ceasefire implemented 4 months ago. That is the estimation presented by Colombia's Broad Fund for Peace in its latest verification report, in which they also expressed concern over military actions that are threatening the unilateral ceasefire.
It is very important that the FARC maintains its truce, but also it is compulsory to move forward towards a bilateral ceasefire.
The report warns about an escalation of the conflict following the decision by President Santos to lift the suspension on airstrikes after 11 soldiers were killed during a military clash last week.
Those air raids that the president ordered to assume allegedly against the insurgency already took the life of indigenous women, but also today we got informed that airstrikes over indigenous and peasants territories in Cauca are taking place.
As government airstrikes threaten the lives of rural residents, members of the Broad Fund for Peace reminded the government that millions of Colombians have been supporting the ongoing peace negotiations as the very only way to bring to an end the war and prevent further victims.
Unfortunately, there are enemies of the peace process taking advantage of unfortunate incidents to boost them in order to discredit the peace process. But what I believe is that the president needs to think with a cool head in these cases.
As for those calling for war, indigenous leaders have called on them, but also on national media outlets, to shed light on the consequences that war keeps on having over the communities living in the conflict zones.
A massacre against indigenous people took place recently when 8 indigenous resistants were assassinated in less than a week. And nothing at all regarding this have been said in the national media.
It's called to value all Colombians' lives equally, but mainly and foremost to realize how many lives can be saved by a definitive cessation of hostilities. Natalia Margarita, TeleSUR, Bogotá.
Chile is still on high alert after southern Calbuco volcano violently erupted Wednesday. President Michelle Bachelet visited the affected area after the volcano erupted for the first time in half a century, forcing the evacuation of at least 5,000 people. Authorities declared a state of emergency, and the army was sent in to evacuate a 21-kilometer radius around the mountain. Last month's eruption of the nearby Villarrica volcano also prompted evacuations in one of the numerous natural disasters that have affected the country in recent months. The airport service in Costa Rica's capital was closed temporarily after the eruption of the Turrialba volcano. The mountain, some 60 kilometers from San Jose, spewed gas and ash over various parts of the area. A total of 17 flights were cancelled. Eurozone finance ministers are once again meeting in Latvia to continue talks on Greece's reform package. The Riga meeting comes prior to the next Eurogroup session in Brussels in May, a day before Greece is due to pay 750 million euros back to the IMF. EU ministers have been pushing hard for the Syriza government to continue the austerity reforms of its predecessors in order to secure the 7.2 billion euros remaining from its 240 billion loan. Greek Finance Minister Yanis Varoufakis said the left-wing government was willing to make some concessions, but rejected further wage on pension cuts. Meanwhile, European Union leaders continue to meet about the migration crisis. They adopted a number of measures, including committing more ships and other resources. Critics said that the agreements were important, but called for mechanisms to facilitate legal asylum. European leaders agreed to increase funds of vessels and aircraft to monitor the waters, but focused on repatriated migrants.
To the High Representative to propose actions in order to capture and destroy the smugglers' vessels before they can be used. Naturally, this will be in line with international law and respect for human rights. We will step up cooperation against smuggling networks by working through Europol and by deploying immigration officers to third countries.
Although various governments have continued to provide aid to violent oppositions and extremists in Syria, the majority of the residents in those countries have been against such external intervention. Our correspondent Nashwan Abdullah reports on a gathering of activists looking to expose this interference.
On Thursday, international activists held a conference in Damascus in solidarity with the Syrian people and against their country's policies in dealing with the Syrian crisis. Further, they called on the international community to help out with the reconstruction of Syria.
We are here to expose the overt and covert war against Syria, which the international media has sought to depict as a civil war. In fact, it is a war for the recolonization, the restructuring and the fragmentation of this entire region in a manner similar to what was done by the Sykes-Picot Pact at the end of the First World War.
Previously on Wednesday, a French delegation of 17 representatives, including journalists and law activists, visited Syria. In a meeting with the Minister of Tourism, Bashir Yazigi, they declared their solidarity with the Syrian people.
Our message is to resist. What is happening here in Syria and what was happening in Libya and Iraq, and also what is happening in Palestine, confirms that without resistance we will not achieve victory.
The Syrian people are hopeful that these delegations will affect the public opinion of the Western countries, which has been misled by several media sources connected to their governments. Nashwan Abdullah, teleSUR, Damascus, Syria.
Stars from the National Basketball Association were in Cuba for an official training camp with the island's youth. Former NBA stars Dikembe Mutombo and Steve Nash were among those who traveled to the island for the 4-day training camp, the first of its kind by a U.S. sporting league. The stars led Cuban youth in basketball clinics, workshops, and conferences coordinated with the NBA and the International Basketball Federation. The move comes as the governments of Cuba and the United States work to normalize ties. More on these on our website, telesurtv.net/English. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.